In 2002, Musk traveled to Russia to look at the intergalactic ballistic missiles that were capable of sending payloads into space.
Wait, did he say intergalactic missiles?
The intergalactic ballistic missiles.
Oh, Jesus. Which way, spaceflight fan? Elon fanboys or Starship skeptics? Twitter likes or no Twitter likes? Wide SN11 or Doggy Coin?
Doggy Coin. Tweeting about Doggy Coin.
Doggy Coin? Are you kidding me? What the fuck? Honestly, I didn't expect to be pulling a Peter Beck and eating my hat this early on in the history of my YouTube channel. Now, I want to be clear that not Common Sense Skeptic specifically. People like him are really important to the spaceflight community because basically they keep us in check. We have to be critical and hold companies and agencies that don't meet their promises accountable. Otherwise, we will just end up letting anything slide. So, in case you didn't know, Common Sense Skeptic is sort of this weird fringe YouTuber that really has an infatuation for Elon Musk. He has lots of videos about Starship, and I'm going to cover most of them. Not all of them though. If I skip one of his episodes, I'll show some text as to why it was left out. Quick spoiler alert, however, I do actually agree with him on quite a few main points. That being said, I also have a problem with the majority of his points.
At 160 feet tall and 30 feet across, the Starship empty prototype shell Musk unveiled in Boca Chica towered over the crowd in attendance as Musk told them it would have a payload capacity of 100 metric tons, unlimited reusability, and room for 100 people at a time to facilitate Mars colonization. All we are going to do with simple math is demonstrate how the ship, as presently designed, is nowhere near capable of delivering on that promise.
Okay, I do agree with the whole 100 people thing, as do most SpaceX fans, and actually SpaceX is kind of coming around to agreeing that the 100 crew members thing probably won't happen, at least not for a long time. That's been made pretty obvious by the size of the Dare Moon crew. So for a good portion of this video, he goes into more depth on the 100 crew thing, so I'll skim over that. There is one thing he says that does really bother me, and that's this clip here.
Those compartments would also have a 2-foot wide access port, which is too small for most adults, especially if they're wearing bulky spacesuits.
So this is assuming that they don't have proprietary launch seating, and that crew members would be wearing their pressure suits to their cabins for some reason. Also, the SpaceX pressure suits are not really what you'd call bulky. So in the next part of episode 1, he goes over how much food and water it would take to sustain a crew of 100 for a duration of 9 months.
The Starship is already 121,000 pounds short of payload capacity, and we haven't added anything else to the cabin yet. No clothes, books, computers, environmental systems, bridge controls, or exercise equipment. No beds, chairs, ladders, walls, or bulkheads. Not even the 280-pound spacesuits that each crew member will require.
Again, I mostly agree, but the 280-pound spacesuit he's referring to is the EVA spacesuit used by astronauts on the ISS, and EVAs only, not the pressure suit crew members are required to wear as a precaution during launch and probably during landing. I'm not sure if SpaceX would actually make a purpose-built EVA suit for each individual crew member. The ones on the ISS, for example, can be resized on orbit. I feel like it would be a little bit inconvenient if for every new crew member of the ISS they have to make an entire new EMU, keeping in mind they're not cheap, launch it, and then, since it's useless because it's only made for a specific person, deorbit it. I couldn't find an exact figure for the weight of the SpaceX pressure suits, but the similar suits used by Starliner only weigh 20 pounds, so it's a little bit dishonest what he's saying.
Modern ULA boosters are constructed from thick aluminum plates that are milled into a diamond or grilled lattice, which provides structural support. The base material of this outer skin is roughly the width of a human thumb. It is friction stir welded along the entire seam, producing a joint that is indistinguishable from either piece. In this giant cylinder, there are only 4 such seams, creating what is, in effect, one solid piece of aluminum tube. But this is what Starship is made out of, sheets of 301 stainless steel.
Starship will and does have interior stringers.
The width of a dime. This ultra-thin material is stamped or cut into pieces, and welded together, requiring thousands of seams to hold together these small sheets of thin material that is notoriously difficult to work with. Fewer seams, fewer problems.
Though I do agree that the ring sections, while simplifying production, do add more points of failure to Starship. It's unclear at this point if SpaceX is going to always use that thickness of ring sections, or if they're just going to use it for their prototypes.
It has direct access to the central vertical corridor of the ship, which may work fine when the vehicle is in space and not subject to gravity, but when the crew are climbing aboard on Earth and debarking on Mars, they will not be able to float between decks, and there doesn't seem to be an elevator in this diagram, or even a ladder.
The design doesn't show a ladder. Okay. I mean, come on, dude. Use your brain here. There's gonna be a ladder.
Considering they will all be wearing bulky 280-pound spacesuits on and off this craft at either end, this would seem to be a major oversight.
Yes. Instead of wearing pressure suits, they'll climb up the ladder in their EVA suit, instead of having the EVA suit right next to the airlock and just wearing pressure suits in the inside of the craft. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Musk revealed to the world on Twitter that the purpose of the giant atrium windows in the nose cone of Starship would be used for travelers to enjoy concerts. And what a backdrop it would be. Unfortunately for Musk, the giant sunlight will only ever be science fiction. Space windows are damned heavy and incredibly expensive.
Again, this is a point where I and most spaceflight fans agree that the windows are unrealistic. Newer renders have shown the atrium window section as being smaller than previous renders. If they happen at all, they won't be made using the same method as the cupola's windows. There's been talk of transparent aluminium as being an option, but time will tell whether that works out or not.
Our conclusion is that Starship falls well short of being able to accommodate 100 crew in any regard, which is consistent with NASA recommendations regarding required volume per crew member. In 2013, NASA's Human Research Program issued a report stating their recommended minimum net habitable volume per crew member. Their team compared other space stations and the volume per crew member before coming up with their absolute minimum of 25 cubic meters per person, well below any other former craft. According to the SpaceX presentation, Starship has 825 cubic meters of pressurized cabin, which may be more than an A380 cabin. But according to NASA findings, this is only enough space for a maximum of 17 crew, 83 short of the promised 100.
I actually agree with his conclusion here. Now, be warned, future videos in his series will focus a lot on the 100 crew figure. Also, can I just say, I fucking hate his audio settings here. He's put this echo effect on his voice that makes him sound like some sort of ethereal being.
Just off the top of our heads, a spacefaring vehicle should have the following facilities: a flight deck, an operations deck, a mechanical deck, 40 private crew cabins that Musk promised, a galley for food prep, likely also housing their laundry facility, an exercise deck, the airlock and proposed cable crane to the surface, dry storage, water tanks, and treatment tanks. Now let's check these off against the unlabeled diagram presented at Musk's unveiling speeches. We'll just have to use our best guesses based on their location on the ship. So we have the flight deck in the nose, the ops deck just below that, the crew cabins, airlock and crane structure, one deck of dry storage, the galley deck just above the crew cabins, and the exercise above it. But then we're all out of room. There's no space left for the mechanical deck, the water tanks, or the treatment tanks. Oh, we also don't seem to have the large common area that Musk promised, the nose cone atrium concert area Musk tweeted pictures of, no escape pods to go along with the absence of an abort system, no medical bay, no bathrooms, that's kind of a big one, and Musk also promised a solar storm shelter that's unaccounted for. And you won't be growing any fresh veggies on the way because there is no room for a hydroponics lab.
So, most of his criticisms here seem to boil down to there not being enough space for all the other systems required while having 40 crew cabins for 100 people. I agree, again. That being said, a lot of the other rooms he adds here can be lumped in with other rooms. You don't necessarily need separate rooms for kitchen, laundry, toilet, bathroom, and solar storm shelter, seeing as these all use very similar utilities. But that could just be the North American in him talking. Ask anyone who lives in the United Kingdom if they need a separate room to do their laundry. A far more reasonable representation of what Starship would look like is this fan-made one by Mike LePage.
Moving on down to the second level, we come to the radiation shelter, which is also where the majority of the water stores would be kept. Water is an excellent radiation attenuator, so it makes sense that this is also where the kitchen would be, or anything else that requires fluid management, like toiletries, bathing, or exercise equipment.
A concert theatre will always be unrealistic. It's more of a could look like rather than a will look like. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Escape pods. Why would they have escape pods? They would add a huge amount of complexity to an already complex spacecraft. And if they did, how often would they be useful? That's kind of comparable to having ejection seats on Gemini and the space shuttle. Hydroponics. I doubt they will be growing food on the way. If they do, it won't be much. My guess is that would likely be pre-staged on Mars, if they do it at all. Again, he goes back to the 100-person thing.
The medical bay that doesn't appear in Musk's diagram would have to be able to handle everything from stitches to gynecological exams to broken bones, perhaps even emergency surgery. To my knowledge, nobody has performed surgery in space. There would have to be a determination of the number of beds required, but certainly more than one. The bay would have to be completely self-contained and fully stocked, have an ability to take x-rays, include the ability to be sealed off hermetically from the rest of the ship in case of an infectious disease, and it probably bears mentioning, when recruiting colonists for these vessels, ensuring one of them is a doctor or a surgeon would definitely be a good idea.
Again with a surgical bay, I doubt they would have a dedicated surgical bay in a separate room. They might have one or two drop-down beds for emergencies along with basic surgical and first aid equipment, possibly a small x-ray machine, but again, pre-staging is a solution to a lot of the comms he has here.
The mechanical deck that is conspicuously absent in the SpaceX diagram is where they would install the equipment required to maintain ship's operations. Many reporters have found it odd that SpaceX has not released any real details as to this aspect of the craft, but all these departments would have to be covered, amongst others.
Water processing, air filtration, and life support systems are obviously imperative, but they're not nearly as big as you'd expect. You certainly don't need an entire deck dedicated to just these things. For power generation, they will have solar arrays, and I'm sure they can squeeze in batteries somewhere. Again, you don't really need a dedicated electrical room. Plumbing. Good luck getting a detailed plumbing plan for a spacecraft that doesn't even exist yet. Engine compartment. Wait. Engine compartment?
Since the majority of the diagrams and concept art online depict persons sitting in chairs, standing nicely on the deck, eating meals, one would have to assume SpaceX has some sort of artificial gravity generator lined up. But of course they don't, because that's fictional.
Artificial gravity generator? No, asshole. The rocket is clearly meant to be standing up. Not to mention that this fan-made render was made in SketchUp, where these people, known as scale people, are used to show scale.
Or the XEMU will be the universal fashion while on the surface of Mars, or the Moon, or anywhere other than Earth. At a hefty 280 pounds apiece, those travelers who didn't keep up with their daily exercise regimen will definitely be feeling the burn after an hour or two in one of these fashion plates. Considering the condition Commander Scott Kelly was in after his time on the ISS, it will actually be a feat for any of them just to suit up. We wonder where they plan on storing 100 of these, along with all the spare parts, and considering it's another 15 tons of mass.
EVA suits. They will likely be stored in that storage compartment there, and will weigh a lot less in the Martian gravity. Scott Kelly spent a year in microgravity, not 7 months, or the more realistic 4 months expected from a Starship trip to Mars. I'm going to be skipping episode 3 because I agree that 1 million people on Mars by 2050 will probably not happen. And episode 4 is about comparisons to Christopher Columbus and points he will cover in future episodes.
As a side note, there are some people who believe Starship is also going to replace international air travel on Earth, so let's nip that in the bud right now while we're here. On top of all the logistical nightmares that would accompany such a proposal, the fuel bill on the Starship is quite frankly ridiculous. For a single Starship launch worth of fuel that would carry 100 passengers, you can fly a Boeing 747 with a passenger capacity of 416 persons for 450 hours, and you don't have to make the guests buy custom-tailored flight suits.
Ground-to-ground Starship launches. I agree. This is going to be largely impractical, and it's going to be decades away if it happens at all.
Starship somehow slows its velocity enough while in orbit to cause the fuel in the tanker to flood forward into the Starship holds, which is a neat trick, since both vehicles' main engines are being blocked by the other vehicle, leaving only small maneuvering thrusters in the nose to possibly force the ship backwards hard enough to cause the payload to slosh forward.
Yes, reaction control thrusters are sufficient and have been used for ullage for a long time.
Which brings up a point to quickly touch on. Vehicles in LEO have a mean orbital velocity of about 17,000 miles per hour or 28,000 kilometers per hour. If the vehicle slows down significantly, its orbit will degrade. Just as if it speeds up, it will climb further away from Earth into a higher orbit until it leaves LEO. How do they expect to slam on the brakes and maintain their velocity and orbit?
Okay, speed it up, then flip it, then slow it down for the next orbit. The change in velocity will be negligible anyway, so that's only if they have to worry about their orbit in the first place.
It actually doesn't seem to be a very feasible concept at all, especially since the fuel they would be transferring would be in the payload compartment, not the main propellant tanks as shown in the demonstration slides.
How does he think oxidizer gets from the header tank to the engines? Plumbing, whether it's internal or external.
See, most large tanks made for hauling liquids contain baffles to minimize slosh in the tank while in motion. This includes most other spacefaring vehicles. For example, the large lightweight external tank on the space shuttle, a vessel similar in diameter to Super Heavy, had anti-slosh baffles.
So Musk talks about slosh baffles as being a maybe, and there are already types of slosh baffles in the Starship prototypes. We saw that great camera view on the SN11 launch. I do agree that the finer points of on-orbit refueling need to be ironed out, and so does NASA, hence why they awarded a contract to SpaceX to prove orbital refueling can be done at the scale they need it for. There are already refueling experiments being done on board the ISS as well.
Musk is continuously going on and on about how the Starship program is going to take full advantage of rapidly reusable rockets, but there's definitely a bit of a gap in the logic. First, if the Starship itself is going to be going to Mars and staying with the people that brought there, that's not a reusable craft.
Yeah, easy answer there, it won't stay on Mars.
Second, if he's under the impression that his refueling system is going to work the way he presents it during his unveilings, he's completely unaware of spaceflight industry incident rates and ignoring his own company's rocket recovery record, which has had 10 failures in 65 attempts, 2 of which were in the spring of 2020. This still frame from their launch video shows how SpaceX intends to land Super Heavy, one of the largest boosters ever made, right back onto its own landing mount.
In his defense, they have changed their plans in regards to landing, or, well, catching Super Heavy since he recorded this video.
While a fully fueled tanker sits just a couple hundred yards away. This Super Heavy vehicle, if it doesn't come in perfectly every time, could take out that entire facility. So when the inevitable happens, and this machine explodes on the pad, how bad is it going to be?
So he thinks SpaceX will just leave a fully fueled tanker Starship right next to the launch pad and not do the logical thing of having it away from the pad until the booster is landed, then roll it out to the launch tower, then stack it on top of Super Heavy, and then finally fuel it up. Okay, so what he does next is a little bit ridiculous, so I'll just play it.
Since we don't know how much fuel will still be on board when it lands, we'll run the numbers as if the vehicle explodes on the launch pad during a takeoff, and that'll cover both scenarios. The Starship carries 1,200 tons of propellant. The Super Heavy carries another 3,400 tons. A tanker would have another 100 tons in the payload compartment, but we'll run this as if it's a crewed mission. And then, we're going to compare the results against the nuclear bomb that took out Hiroshima. 4,600 tons of propellant is 4.6 million kilos. According to EPA.gov, 4.6 million kilos of methane contains 255 billion BTUs of energy. 255 billion BTUs equates to 64 kilotons of TNT. And the nuclear bomb that wiped Hiroshima off the map was a 15 kiloton device. So, super heavy, fully loaded with the Starship, is equal in potential energy to about 4 Hiroshimas. There's a really neat feature on the website nuclearsecrecy.com, and it allows you to pick a city, pick a weapons yield in kilotons, and see what the blast radius of any side strike would be. Now, this is meant for nuclear explosions, but that's the type of energy we're dealing with, so fireballs and blast radius would be similar. Let's pick on Washington, D.C., because everybody seems to these days. 64 kiloton yield will drop it right on the National Mall. Here's what it would look like, with 103,000 dead. Another favorite target in movies is New York, specifically Manhattan. Boom, 320,000 dead, and the south end of the island is leveled. How about a launch in Boca Chica, Texas, where the Starship facility is actually located? Well, that would wipe out the entire production facility, Boca Chica Village, the nature sanctuary to the south, and the Seaside State Park. And of course, with rockets, it's never if one of them is going to blow up, it's a matter of when.
Now, I'm no physicist, but I don't think you need to be a physicist to realize that a methane explosion doesn't work in the exact same way as a nuclear one. So let's say that Starship SN9 had the required 33 tons of methane needed for landing on board as it gracefully gave a high five to the ground. That's equivalent to 1.587 million BTUs, which is about 0.4 kilotons of TNT. If we plug that into Nuke Map, we can see that not only is the landing pad destroyed, so is SN10, Pad A, Pad B, the road, the tank farm, and essentially the entirety of the Boca Chica launch site. But as we can see from the footage, it barely scratched the launch pad, and SN10 hardly noticed it was there. So methane explosions are not the same as nuclear ones. Who'da thunk? Now, I don't know why he insists on using outdated 3D renders. These renders were done before we knew the positions of the header tanks, and they show the oxidizer tank where the methane tank is currently. It's stuff like this that makes me wonder if it's a joke or not. I don't think it is, but this is just Poe's law in full effect.
Let's put the efficiency of this entire refueling concept into terms that is dead easy to understand. If the trucking industry worked on this same premise, the driver of this truck would be using everything in the big tank to deliver the contents of the small one.
Yeah, that's just the rocket equation though, isn't it? So in episode 6, he picks a food and then runs with it because he knows this particular food will not work well on Mars. Bread is not a good food for Mars. The area of crops you would need compared with the calories gained is ridiculously poor. Potatoes are a much better option for Mars. They are far more calorie intensive per the area of land required. Nuking Mars. This is a terrible idea and will never happen, and Musk knows it. So here he tries to address the Starship explosion thing. He doesn't. In fact, he kind of proves himself wrong.
For reference, ammonium nitrate has an energy density of 1.4 megajoules per kilogram and a detonation velocity of 2,550 meters per second. Methane gas has an energy density of 55.6 megajoules per kilogram and a detonation velocity of 1,800 meters per second.
And uranium-235, the uranium isotope used in the Hiroshima bomb, has an energy density of 144 million megajoules per kilogram, and an initial detonation velocity of 20,000 to 50,000 meters per second. Not exactly comparable to methane.
And unlike nuclear weapons, which only release 50% of their energy as blast, with 35% released as heat and 15% released as radiation, 100% of conventional explosives go into creating the blast.
100% of conventional explosives go into creating the blast. Well, okay, it's good methane isn't a conventional explosive then. Like, what? Episode 8 is Starship Point to Point. I'm not going to bother with that since I agree Point to Point is a bad idea and will probably not happen. And episode 9 is just viewer questions. So in episode 10, he talks a lot about radiation shielding, but one Google search yielded better results than his entire video. The short story is, Starship won't have major radiation shielding around the entire hull of the ship. Instead, they'll use a bit more Delta V to shorten the transit time to and from Mars, and have a solar storm shelter in the middle of the ship, as I showed in the previous fan-made animation. Keep in mind, this is just the general consensus of the community, not official reports from SpaceX, but come on, use a bit of common sense here. So, despite the solution being so easily available, Common Sense Skeptic still essentially bases this entire 11-minute video on a what if. That being, what if Starship used 50cm thick water tanks around the entire hull of the ship to shield from cosmic radiation.
As a quick side note, some people on various chat feeds have declared that we have the LOX and the CH4 tanks backwards, and that it is the cryogenic methane tank that occupies the upper chamber. As you can see from this SpaceX slide, that is not how it's presented.
So he's doubling down on the methane tank thing?
And really, it makes sense to have the LOX closest to the living area should they happen to need extra oxygen in the cab.
Oh no, what if they need more oxygen in the cabin? If only there was a tank of liquid oxygen at the very top of the spacecraft, right next to the pressurized area. They really should have thought about that one. You're so smart. You know, you should work for SpaceX.
But as we've demonstrated, water will not be the solution that they're looking for, because the amount of water required outweighs the payload capacity of the vehicle.
Congratulations, you just came to the same conclusion that the majority of the spaceflight community already came to. Episode 11 is an SN8 flight analysis, so I'm going to skip that. So the submarine comparison is irrelevant to me, as it's based on the 100 crew capacity figure, but he does talk a lot about the importance of psychological screening and the hierarchy of crew members, which I definitely agree with.
Yet in the animations on YouTube for Starship, you see giant atrium windows extending 3 decks high, acting as a backdrop for violin concertos. Tell us, once she stops playing, how's she supposed to get back down?
Swim like they did on Skylab? Have someone jump and come get her? Come on dude, use a little bit of common sense.
Besides, isn't that the location of the LOX header tank?
Yes, it is now. By the shape of the fins versus the current ones, I'd say that this render was done before the liquid oxygen header tank was in the nose cone, just like it is in that outdated graphic you keep bringing up.
But we guarantee that if travelers are given the choice between violin concerts and bringing along another 10 tons of water, or food, or solar panels, or toilet paper, they won't be booking the violinist. Every nook and cranny of the Starship should be loaded down with the supplies that travelers will need. There should be absolutely no wasted space.
Yes, I agree. If that concert thing ever happens, it will be strictly in low Earth orbit so they don't have to worry about supplies.
And how the hell a giant cigar tube with no extendable legs is supposed to land upright in an uneven field of talcum powder?
So on the topic of landing legs, it was confirmed a while ago now that they will be changing them. So in episode 13, he talks about the FAA in relation to Boca Chica, and then says Texas will secede from the Union. All in a Starship video. I really hope you can't hear me cringing right now. Artificial gravity. I agree with him that further research is required on this topic, but there is an easy solution for Starship. Don't do it. That's it. Just don't do it. If it's too complicated, don't bother.
Yes! 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 Yes!
Whoa,
No!
whoa, whoa,
No!
whoa.
No!
Oh my God.
Fuck!
There you
Shit!
Here's the brass tacks. Starship is not going to be human-rated. Why? It has no abort system planned, nor is that capability a likelihood. All current human-rated space vehicles have the ability to rip the humans aboard away from a catastrophic failure.
NASA would never certify a spacecraft with no abort system, let alone fly it for 30 years.
During the flip maneuver on landing, although 3 engines fired up, 2 of them had shut down again before landing,
Yeah, as planned.
and one of those had ruptured a methane line, causing orange fire to wash up the vehicle as it landed.
Yeah, and they've already developed a procedure for fixing it for the next flight.
When it landed, the vehicle bounced off the ground because the landing legs that SpaceX installed are ridiculously useless. In fact, 3 of them were swinging in the wind as it landed and came to rest with a leaning angle.
The loads were well beyond what the legs could handle, and they're going to be adding new legs anyway.
That fire continued in the skirt, eventually erupting out the side of the craft and launching it a second time. Now check this frame out from just before the eruption. The first indication this was going to end poorly is a deformation in the nose cone. right here as the bottom portion of the rocket was forced upwards from the explosion. Then the bottom portion of the craft tore apart like paper as the methane tank above it ruptured. Except that's not the methane tank, is it? That's the LOX tank. The methane tank is supposed to be the higher tank, by all accounts.
Not yours.
As a quick side note, some people on various chat feeds have declared that we have the LOX and the CH4 tanks backwards, and that it is the cryogenic methane tank that occupies the upper chamber. As you can see from this SpaceX slide, that is not how it's presented. And remember the deformation in the nose cone? How exactly are the engineers at SpaceX expecting that structure to hold up when this vehicle is approaching max Q? Without additional support, that's going to rip right off the vehicle and send whatever or whoever is in it back to Earth much quicker than expected.
Yeah, it's going to be full of more support, including a central support structure in the middle with the ladder. And there's going to be more support in the floors that separate the decks.
Let's just for a minute talk about this belly flop maneuver that SpaceX is trying to perfect. Would anybody like to defend this nonsense, or can we pretty much agree that this system of putting the craft down is useless, especially when talking about human cargo?
Yes, I would like to defend the belly flop maneuver.
The last second flip will dislodge anything not bolted to the floor.
Which is why everything will be bolted to the floor.
It'll slosh propellants around in the tanks.
Which is why they have header tanks.
And whip people inside around like dolls. It will endanger those people and the craft every time they attempt to put it down.
If they forget to fasten the seatbelts on their purpose-built seats.
Even if they manage to get it right for a couple of times as a re-landing procedure, having people aboard for that maneuver is just asking and waiting for people to die.
Yeah, you could say the same about Apollo. That's the risk of spaceflight. Okay, just quickly, he recently posted this tweet about his concerns over the speed of Starship development versus the quality. Quality over quantity, not so much for these early prototypes. So, let's say SpaceX decided to put a ton of time and money into a proper Starship. We're talking nothing left out, mass simulation for the payload and vacuum raptors, as well as a full heat shield. Now let's say that Starship explodes, as they are known to do, due to a fault that could have been found and fixed with the sacrifice of a less advanced prototype. That's kind of a no-brainer. Now, I do want to point out that we do agree on a good amount of points. Orbital refueling needs to be proven, the 100 crew capacity on a Starship is unrealistic, the atrium windows are unrealistic, point-to-point Starships are decades away if they ever happen, 1 million people on Mars by 2050 is unrealistic, and the dates SpaceX has put out are, as usual for SpaceX, optimistic at best. People like Thunderfoot are absolutely fine to make criticisms of SpaceX and Starship, right? They could care less about what random internet people say about them. But for this guy to start a petition to try and get the Boca Chica site shut down, despite the FAA continuing to give them multiple green lights to test, is something else. That's starting to get into dangerous territory. Musk clearly doesn't care for the environment and clearly doesn't care for the residents of Brownsville. The creation of this petition out of hatred for Musk with the pretense of environmental concerns is not only disappointing. Frankly, it's pathetic. Hey you flightless arsehole, the video isn't done yet. What more could you possibly have to say? Hush now, children. I have yet to show you this man's Twitter. So if you do follow him, you will see such gems as Muskrat Kool-Aid, insulting Elon's mum, lying prick, a whole lot of simping for Tory Bruno, the CEO of United Launch Alliance. Sooner or later, you muskrats will learn your electric Jesus is a false prophet, like David Korean? So I did spend precious seconds of my life going through Common Sense Skeptic's tweets and sorting them into various categories. They consist of 15% Musk bad, 31.3% Tesla bad, 26.3% Starship/SpaceX bad, 20% generally being an arse, and a staggering 7.5% simping for Tory Bruno. Also, there are a couple of tweets that are a little bit stranger. So make sure to follow him on Twitter if you're into weirdly problematic tweets. And if you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like, subscribe, and shoot me a follow on Twitter. More videos are on the way soon, and I promise this time they will not be about skeptics. Also, anyone who insults my Astro Dad and Astro Uncle automatically goes in my bad books.